British had kind of learned their lesson, knowing that oppression leads to rebellions. So they kind of let the French alone, but they were limited in their opportunities. So they start to come down to the mills in Lawrence and throughout New England. 1864 is the first recorded French-Canadian family getting off a train in Lawrence. And yeah, they're about the only immigrant group that came primarily by train. By 1871, there's 400 families here, and they start the first parish, St. Anne's Parish, of course, the original French-Canadian parish in Lawrence, one of the first 10 in New England, and the focal point of the community for generations after that. Of course, other organizations were formed. Union St. John Baptiste was formed in Lawrence in 1870. So quite early on, we're establishing a presence here. Nevertheless, infamous episode in French-Canadian history in New England occurred in 1881 when the Massachusetts Commissioner of Labor, in his annual report, characterized the French Canadians as, quote, the Chinese of the East. Now, if you know anything about the history of Chinese in America, you know that in 1881, they were reviled and persecuted as alien outsiders who were lowering our labor standards and resistant to assimilation and completely unassimilable. So that characterization of the French Canadians was considered naturally a big insult. But we didn't take it lying down. French Canadians fought back and demanded a hearing with the Commissioner of Labor. And at that hearing, French Canadian community leaders from across Massachusetts spoke out on behalf of our people as being good people contributing to their communities and putting down roots. One of those French Canadian leaders was from Lawrence, a gentleman named Samuel Marier, was part of that contingent. So the commissioner kind of backed down a little bit in his next year's report. Meanwhile, the community in Lawrence is growing, putting down roots, expanding its institutions. St. Anne's builds its own church, which opens, the first church opened in 1874. Soon it's followed by schools. By 1890, the parochial schools in Lawrence, in St. Anne's, I should say, in Lawrence, are the largest in the Diocese of Boston. 900 students are attending the schools of St. Anne's Parish. But for those first few decades, the schools were taught entirely in French. For the first 3 decades, until the 19-teens, French-Canadian schools were taught entirely in French because the ethic of cultural survival, which had developed in Quebec, called survivance, came down with us. Now, survivance was an effort to survive culturally despite being ruled by the British. And it was centered on 3 elements: the French language, the Catholic faith, and the traditional way of life, the habitant family farmer. Now, coming down to the New England mill cities was a violation of that third tenet, so they put even more emphasis on the first 2, remain Catholic and remain French-speaking. So the schools were entirely in French until the 19-teens, which only stopped because they were forced to by state law, as Massachusetts and a number of states became a little concerned about the vast waves of immigrants in America in the early 20th century. But from the teens on, the schools were taught half and half. Half the day in French, half the day in English, which is how my parents were taught, and many of yours too, I'm sure. That remained the case until the 1950s. Meanwhile, the parish and the community are growing rapidly. St. Anne's builds more schools, builds an orphanage, builds a residence for the Marist brothers who are teaching the boys in school, and the Good Shepherd nuns have come down from Quebec to teach the girls. This was, by the way, the first Marist establishment in the United States, one that would become many more as the Marist became one of the major orders operating French-Canadian parishes throughout New England. The community grew so fast that we needed a new church within 20 years of the opening of the first St. Anne's, and thus we have the construction of the magnificent St. Anne's Church at the corner of Haverhill and Franklin Streets, which opened in 1906. which seats over 2,300 people, and which they managed to fill 5 times every Sunday with the parishioners of St. Anne's Parish. Around that time, we also produced the most famous French-Canadian Laurentian, our own Robert Goulet. He was born in 1933, attended St. Anne's schools until 1947. He also did his first public performances here in Lawrence at the urging of his father, who had appeared in many local amateur theatricals. Goulet never forgot his Lawrence roots, came back to visit many times his friends and family who remained here. Now, come the 1950s, things are changing in Lawrence. The mills are closing fairly rapidly. The economy is declining. Jobs are disappearing. Meanwhile, the country is changing. People are moving out to the suburbs, and particularly if you have the economic means, that's the thing to do. So many of the French Canadians move out to the surrounding towns, Methuen, Salem, New Hampshire, etc., etc. The community here in Lawrence begins to shrink and decline. There is one last infusion of French blood, however, in the early 1960s, when a group of about 100 families from St. Rose du Virgilis, and I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that right, come down here to work in primarily in a shoe factory, which was one of the businesses that moved into the vacated textile mill. The last manufacturing jobs around here, many of them were these shoe shops and garment shops that moved into the textile mill. But people of my generation, and I'm 4th generation, no longer wanted to work in a mill and a sweatshop. So those shoe shops and garment shops recruited immigrants, many of our first Latino neighbors, but also that group of French Canadians who gave us a final infusion of French Canadian language and culture in Lawrence. But finally in 1991, with the dispersal of people and the lack of priests, St. Anne's Parish closed. And believe me, that hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't living in Lawrence at the time, but to hear that something that seemed as permanent as the Rock of Gibraltar, St. Anne's Parish, could possibly close was a real shock, and really is what set me on my way to studying French-Canadian history and learning how did I get here. So the parish is closed. The other parishes, you know, St. Anne sent out mission churches which became other French-Canadian parishes, including Sacred Heart in South Lawrence, Mount Carmel, and St. Teresa's in Methuen. Now, they have since merged with other closed parishes to become, you know, pan-ethnic parishes. But we're still here, and we've done a lot for this city. The city's done a lot for us, and I just want to end by reminding us of the Québécois saying of Je me souviens. We remember, and we will. Thank you very much.